High in the Andes Mountains, where the air grows thin and the peaks pierce the heavens, there once stood a civilization that would span nearly half a continent. In the mist-shrouded valleys of what we now call Peru, among terraced hillsides that stepped like giant stairs toward the sky, the whispers of ancient gods mingled with the footsteps of mortals who would build an empire unlike any the world had seen. The condor soared overhead, its shadow falling across stone paths that would one day stretch from the Amazon rainforest to the Pacific shores, connecting peoples and cultures in a tapestry of remarkable complexity and beauty. The story begins not with grand proclamations or the clash of armies, but with the gentle lapping of waves against the shores of Lake Titicaca, the sacred waters that the people believed had given birth to the sun itself. Here, according to the songs passed down through countless generations, the first Inca emerged from the depths of the lake, chosen by Inti, the sun god, to bring order and civilization to the scattered tribes of the Andes. Manco Cápac, as he came to be known, carried with him a golden staff, and where this staff would sink effortlessly into the earth, there he would establish his capital. The legend speaks of a journey southward, following ancient paths through valleys carpeted with quinoa and potatoes, past rushing rivers that carved their way through mountain gorges like silver threads through green wool. The golden staff tested soil after soil, valley after valley, until at last, in a broad valley surrounded by protective peaks, it sank deep into the fertile earth. Here, where the Huatanay River meandered through grasslands and the mountains stood sentinel on all sides, Manco Cápac founded the city that would become known as Cusco, the navel of the world, though history would remember it by its Spanish name, Cusco. Yet beneath the flowing robes of myth lay the practical reality of human ambition and survival. Archaeological evidence suggests that the people who would become the Incas were likely one of many small tribes inhabiting the Cusco Valley around the 13th century. They were not the first to call this valley home. Pottery shards and burial sites tell of earlier inhabitants, the Quilque people, who had already begun to shape the landscape with their agricultural terraces and simple stone structures. The emerging Inca tribe, perhaps distinguished by their particular devotion to the sun god and their remarkable organizational abilities, began the slow process of absorbing or displacing their neighbors. The early Inca rulers, known as the Sapa Incas or unique Incas, were as much spiritual leaders as political ones. They were believed to be direct descendants of Inti, the sun god, their divine nature setting them apart from ordinary mortals. This sacred kingship became the cornerstone of Inca civilization, lending legitimacy to their expanding authority and creating a unifying belief system that would prove essential to governing their eventual empire. Manco Cápac's successor, according to the carefully preserved royal genealogies, was Sinchi Roca, whose name meant valorous prince. His reign, like those of the earliest Inca rulers, remained shrouded in the mists of oral tradition and royal mythology. The chroniclers who would later record these stories, working from the memories of elderly nobles and the knotted cord records called quipus, painted these early reigns in broad strokes of gradual expansion and cultural development. Sinchi Roca was said to have consolidated the Inca hold on the Cusco Valley and begun the process of incorporating neighboring alus, the kinship groups that formed the basic social unit of Andean society. The third Sapa Inca, Loque Yupanqui, continued this gradual expansion, his reign notable for the development of agricultural techniques that would become hallmarks of Inca civilization. The famous terraces that stepped up mountainsides, like stone staircases, began to take shape during this period, transforming steep slopes into productive farmland. These Andines, as they were called, represented not merely agricultural innovation, but a profound reshaping of the landscape itself, turning the mountains into partners in human survival rather than obstacles to overcome. Under Manco Cápac, the fourth Sapa Inca, the boundaries of Inca territory began to push beyond the immediate Cusco Valley. This expansion was not the dramatic conquest of later periods, but rather a gradual process of alliance, intermarriage, and careful diplomacy backed by the growing reputation of Inca military prowess. The Inca understood that lasting dominion came not from the sword alone, but from the willing cooperation of subject peoples, achieved through a combination of generous treatment for those who submitted willingly and overwhelming force for those who resisted. The reign of Cápac Yupanqui, the fifth Sapa Inca, marked a significant escalation in both the scope and sophistication of Inca expansion. Under his leadership, Inca armies ventured further from their mountain stronghold, establishing the patterns of conquest and integration that would characterize the empire at its height. The Inca developed a sophisticated understanding of Andean geography and climate, recognizing that their highland culture needed adaptation to rule over the diverse environments of their expanding territory. Inca Roca, the sixth Sapa Inca, presided over a period of internal development that would prove as important as external conquest. The growing complexity of Inca society demanded new forms of organization and administration. The Elu system, based on kinship and mutual obligation, was expanded and formalized into the foundation of Inca governance. Every member of society belonged to an Elu, which served simultaneously as family, economic unit, and administrative division. These groups were responsible for providing labor for public works, soldiers for military campaigns, and tribute for the state, while in return they received protection, emergency supplies during times of scarcity, and participation in the elaborate festival calendar that marked the rhythm of Inca life. The administrative genius of the Incas lay not in replacing existing social structures, but in incorporating them into a larger system. Local chiefs and traditional leaders were often maintained in their positions, becoming intermediaries between their people and the Inca state. This policy of cultural accommodation, combined with the strategic relocation of populations when necessary, allowed the Incas to govern diverse peoples without the constant rebellions that plagued other empires. Atahualpa, the seventh Sapa Inca, faced the first serious external threat to the growing Inca domain. The Chanca Confederation, a powerful group of tribes from the north, launched a major invasion of Inca territory, their armies sweeping down from the mountains like an avalanche of bronze and leather. The attack came when Atahualpa was elderly, and according to the chronicles, he fled the capital rather than face the enemy in battle. This moment of crisis would prove to be a turning point in Inca history, for it was here that one of the most remarkable figures in the empire's annals would first display the qualities that would transform a regional kingdom into a continental power. Viracocha Inca, the eighth Sapa Inca, initially followed his father's cautious approach, withdrawing from Cusco as the Chanca forces approached. But among the royal family was a prince whose vision extended far beyond mere survival. This prince, known to history as Cusi Yupanqui, would later take the throne name Pachacuti, meaning earthshaker or transformer of the world. When the Chanca armies surrounded Cusco, expected to find a defenseless city, they instead faced a determined resistance led by the young prince and his loyal supporters. The Battle of Cusco, as it came to be remembered, was fought not merely with weapons, but with the power of divine intervention, or so the Inca believed. At the crucial moment when the outcome hung in the balance, the very stones of the battlefield were said to have risen up as warriors to fight alongside the Incas. Whether through superior tactics, desperate courage, or divine favor, the Chanca forces were not merely defeated but utterly routed. Their confederation shattered and their threat eliminated forever. This victory transformed Kusi Yupanqui from a prince into a legend, and soon after, following the abdication of his father, he ascended to the throne as Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui. His reign, which began around 1438, would fundamentally alter the nature and scope of Inca civilization. Where previous rulers had been content with gradual expansion and regional dominance, Pachacuti envisioned an empire that would unite the entire Andean world under Inca rule. The transformation began at home, in Cusco itself. Pachacuti ordered the complete rebuilding of the capital, turning it from a collection of modest stone buildings into a magnificent city worthy of an imperial dynasty. The urban plan he implemented was both practical and symbolic, with the city laid out in the shape of a puma, the sacred jaguar of the mountains. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman formed the head of the puma, its massive stone walls incorporating blocks so precisely cut and fitted that no mortar was needed to hold them together. These stones, some weighing more than 100 tons, were quarried from sites miles away and transported by teams of workers using only ropes, levers, and human strength. The heart of the new Cusco was the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, whose walls were said to be covered in sheets of gold that reflected the light of Inti, the solar deity. Here, the mummified remains of deceased Sapa Incas were kept, dressed in fine textiles and served daily meals as if they were still alive. These royal mummies, called malqui, were not merely relics, but active participants in the governance of the empire, consulted on important decisions, and carried through the streets during festivals in elaborate processions that reminded the people of their divine ruler's eternal presence. Around the temple and palace complexes, Pachacuti created a city of remarkable sophistication. Stone channels carried fresh water through every neighborhood, while carefully engineered drainage systems prevented flooding during the rainy season. The streets were paved with fitted stones, wide enough for llama caravans, but narrow enough to provide natural defense points during times of trouble. Gardens and plazas provided gathering spaces for the elaborate ceremonies that mark the Inca calendar, while storehouses built into the hillsides ensured that the city could survive extended sieges. But Pachacuti's vision extended far beyond urban planning. He fundamentally reorganized Inca society along lines that would enable the administration of a vast empire. The traditional Alu system was expanded into a decimal hierarchy that could encompass millions of people. At the base were groups of 10 families, headed by a Kamayuk responsible for their welfare and productivity. 10 of these groups formed a unit of 100 families under a Pachaca Curaca, 10 of which formed a unit of 1,000 under a Waranca Curaca, and so on up to units of 10,000 under a Hunu Curaca. This system allowed for efficient communication, resource allocation, and labor mobilization across enormous distances and diverse populations. The empire that Pachacuti began to build was fundamentally different from other ancient civilizations in its approach to conquest and integration. Rather than simply extracting tribute from conquered peoples, the Incas sought to incorporate them fully into their expanding civilization. This process, known as Incaization, involved the systematic transformation of local societies according to Inca models, while preserving elements of local culture that did not conflict with imperial administration. When Inca armies approached a new territory, they were often preceded by diplomats bearing gifts and promises. Local leaders were invited to submit voluntarily, accepting Inca rule in exchange for confirmation in their positions, integration into the imperial hierarchy, and access to the benefits of Inca civilization. These benefits were substantial: superior agricultural techniques that could increase crop yields, sophisticated textile production methods, access to goods from across the empire through the state distribution system, and protection from enemies and natural disasters through the imperial storehouse network. For those who accepted Inca rule willingly, the transition was often remarkably smooth. Local deities were incorporated into the Inca pantheon as regional manifestations of the great gods, while local customs were preserved as long as they did not conflict with imperial law. The children of local nobles were brought to Cusco for education, where they learned Quechua, the Inca language, along with imperial history, law, and administration. These young people then returned to their home regions as intermediaries between the imperial government and local populations, carrying with them both the knowledge of Inca methods and the personal relationships that made governance possible. Resistance, when it occurred, was met with overwhelming force, followed by systematic reconstruction. Rebellious populations might find themselves relocated to distant parts of the empire, their places taken by loyal colonists called Mitmac. These forced migrations served multiple purposes. They broke up potentially rebellious groups, provided loyal populations in strategic locations, spread Inca culture and language, and allowed for the more efficient exploitation of natural resources by matching populations with appropriate environments. The expansion of Inca territory under Pachacuti followed natural geographic lines and strategic considerations. To the south, Inca armies pressed into the territory of the Colla and Lupaca peoples around Lake Titicaca, the sacred lake where Inca mythology located the birth of their civilization. This region, with its vast herds of llamas and alpacas, and its rich agricultural potential, became one of the most prosperous provinces of the empire. The local populations, already organized in complex societies with their own traditions of monumental architecture and sophisticated agriculture, adapted relatively easily to Inca rule. Northward expansion proved more challenging, as it brought the Incas into conflict with the numerous small kingdoms and tribal confederations of the northern highlands. These societies, while technologically similar to the Incas, had their own proud traditions and established leadership structures. The conquest of the Huanca people, who controlled the fertile Mantaro Valley, required several campaigns and demonstrated the Inca ability to learn from setbacks and adapt their tactics to local conditions. The Inca military machine that Pachacuti developed was built around the principle of overwhelming numerical superiority backed by superior logistics and organization. Inca armies could field tens of thousands of soldiers, drawn from the conscript labor obligations of the Ayla system. These forces were organized in decimal units, matching the civil administration, allowing for efficient command and control. While individual Inca warriors were not necessarily superior to their enemies in weapons or fighting techniques, their armies benefited from standardized equipment, professional officer corps, and the ability to maintain supply lines across vast distances. Inca weapons were well crafted, but not technologically advanced compared to those of their enemies. Warriors carried bronze-tipped spears, wooden clubs studded with bronze or stone spikes, bronze axes, and slings that could hurl stones with devastating accuracy. Body armor consisted of quilted cotton padding that could stop most projectiles, while shields made of wood or hide provided additional protection. The Incas never developed archery as a military art, relying instead on the sling as their primary ranged weapon, a choice that reflected the rocky terrain where most of their battles were fought. More important than weapons was the Inca road system, which began to take shape under Pachacuti and would eventually become one of the wonders of the ancient world. These roads, carved into mountainsides and stretched across desert valleys, allowed Inca armies to move with unprecedented speed and coordination. Messages carried by relay runners called chasqui could travel from Cuzco to the farthest provinces in a matter of days, while armies could march along paved highways equipped with bridges, way stations, and supply depots. The roads themselves were marvels of engineering, designed to accommodate both foot traffic and llama caravans, while following the natural contours of the Andean landscape. Where rivers blocked the way, the Incas built suspension bridges woven from grass ropes, structures strong enough to support heavily laden caravans, yet flexible enough to sway with mountain winds without breaking. In desert regions, the roads were marked by stone pillars that provided navigation points across featureless terrain, while in the mountains, they were often carved directly into cliff faces or built up on stone foundations that could withstand landslides and earthquakes. The administrative system that Pachacuti created to govern his expanding empire was equally impressive in its scope and sophistication. At its center was the concept of reciprocity, the fundamental Andean principle that all relationships, whether between individuals, communities, or the state and its subjects, were based on mutual obligation. The state provided protection, emergency supplies during times of scarcity, and the infrastructure necessary for prosperity, while subjects provided labor service called mita'a, military service when needed, and a portion of their agricultural production. This system eliminated the need for money or markets in the traditional sense. Instead, the state collected agricultural surplus and craft goods, storing them in vast complexes of stone warehouses called kolkas that dotted the landscape near every major settlement. These stores served as insurance against crop failures, supplies for military campaigns, and the foundation for the elaborate festivals and public works projects that demonstrated imperial power and ensured social cohesion. The management of this complex system required sophisticated record-keeping methods, which the Incas achieved through their unique quipu system. These devices, consisting of knotted cords of various colors and materials, could encode numerical information with remarkable precision, and may have been capable of recording narrative information as well. Teams of specially trained officials called quipucamayuks were responsible for creating, maintaining, and interpreting these records, ensuring that tribute obligations were met, population movements were tracked, and resources were allocated efficiently across the empire. Under Pachacuti's leadership, the Inca Empire expanded from a regional kingdom to a major Andean power, but it was his son Tupac Inca Yupanqui who would extend Inca dominion to its greatest geographical extent. Taking the throne around 1471, Tupac Inca inherited both his father's imperial vision and the administrative and military apparatus necessary to realize it on a continental scale. Tupac Inca's first major campaign targeted the powerful Chimu Kingdom on Peru's north coast, a sophisticated civilization that had ruled the coastal valleys for centuries. The Chimu capital of Chanchan was one of the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Americas, its adobe palaces and ceremonial complexes covering more than 6 square miles. The Chimu had developed sophisticated irrigation systems that turned the coastal desert into productive agricultural land. while their craftsmen were renowned throughout the Andes for their work in gold, silver, and textiles. The conquest of the Chimu kingdom presented unique challenges that tested Inca adaptability. The coastal environment was utterly different from the highland regions where Inca military techniques had been developed, while the Chimu's centralized political system and urban culture required different integration strategies than the village-based societies the Incas had previously encountered. The campaign began with the standard Inca diplomatic overtures, offering the Chimu king, Minchansaman, the opportunity to submit peacefully and retain his position as a regional governor under Inca oversight. When these offers were rejected, Tupac Inca launched a systematic invasion that combined highland infantry with coastal allies and innovative siege techniques adapted to desert warfare. The key to Inca victory proved to be their ability to disrupt the Chimu irrigation system, cutting off the water supply that sustained both the agricultural base and the urban population of Chan Chan. This strategy of environmental warfare, which targeted the very foundations of Chimu civilization, forced Minchankaman to surrender rather than watch his people suffer from thirst and starvation. In victory, the Incas demonstrated their characteristic combination of ruthless efficiency and generous integration, relocating Minchankaman to Cusco as an honored member of the imperial court while incorporating Chimu administrative techniques and craft traditions into the imperial system. The conquest of the Chimu kingdom provided the Incas with access to the rich coastal valleys of northern Peru, regions that would become some of the most productive provinces of the empire. Here, the Incas learned to manage complex irrigation systems, developed new techniques for coastal agriculture, and gained access to marine resources that added to the diversity of the imperial economy. Chimu craftsmen, working now under Inca patronage, continued to produce the exquisite metalwork and textiles that had made their kingdom famous, while Chimu administrative techniques influenced the development of imperial governance in coastal regions. With the Pacific coast secured, Tupac Inca turned his attention to the eastern slopes of the Andes, the cloud forest region known as the Montaña, where highland culture met the tropical lowlands of the Amazon basin. This region presented entirely different challenges, with dense forests, unfamiliar diseases, and indigenous populations whose lifestyle and social organization were unlike anything the Incas had previously encountered. The expansion into the Montaña was gradual and often difficult, requiring the development of new military techniques and administrative approaches. The Incas established fortified settlements at strategic points, often on hilltops that could command river valleys and jungle pathways. From these bases, they extended their influence through a combination of alliance, trade, and limited conquest, adapting their methods to the realities of jungle warfare and the complex social dynamics of Amazonian peoples. The most ambitious of Tupac Inca's campaigns, however, was his southern expansion into the territories that would become Chile, Bolivia, and northern Argentina. This campaign, which lasted several years and covered thousands of miles, demonstrated the remarkable logistical capabilities of the Inca military system and the empire's ability to adapt to radically different environments and populations. The southward march began through the high plateau known as the Altiplano, the vast grassland that surrounds Lake Titicaca and extends into modern Bolivia. Here, the Incas encountered peoples who shared many cultural similarities with themselves, including the use of terraced agriculture, sophisticated textile production, and complex social hierarchies. The integration of these populations was relatively straightforward, following established patterns of diplomatic negotiation backed by military pressure. As the Inca armies pressed further south, they entered the territory of the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth. Here, the challenge was not conquest of enemy peoples, but survival in an environment where water was scarce and the landscape was largely barren. The Incas adapted by developing new supply techniques, establishing supply depots at the few oases, and learning to navigate by celestial observation across seemingly featureless terrain. Beyond the desert lay the fertile valleys of central Chile, where the Incas encountered the Mapuche people, fierce warriors who would prove to be among the most difficult opponents the empire ever faced. The Mapuche had developed a decentralized political system that made them difficult to defeat through conventional means, while their guerrilla warfare techniques were perfectly adapted to the forested valleys they called home. The wars with the Mapuche demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the Inca military system. While Inca armies could win major battles and occupy territory, they found it difficult to achieve the decisive victories that would force Mapuche submission. The Mapuche's decentralized leadership meant that defeating one group did not eliminate resistance from others, while their intimate knowledge of local terrain gave them significant advantages in the small-scale engagements that characterized much of the conflict. Eventually, the Incas established a frontier along the Maule River in central Chile, beyond which they were unable to extend effective control. This frontier marked not only the southern limit of Inca expansion, but also a recognition that there were practical limits to imperial growth, even for a state as sophisticated and powerful as the Inca Empire had become. The establishment of this southern frontier required the development of new defensive strategies and administrative techniques. The Incas built a series of fortified settlements along the border, garrisoned by professional soldiers and loyal colonists who could provide early warning of Mapuche raids, while maintaining Inca control over the submitted populations. These frontier communities developed their own distinct culture, blending highland Inca traditions with adaptations to the Chilean environment and the constant threat of warfare. Meanwhile, in the northern regions of the empire, Tupac Inca's generals were pushing Inca boundaries into what is now Ecuador and southern Colombia. Here, they encountered the sophisticated kingdoms of the northern Andes, including the Quitu Confederation and the powerful Cañari people. These societies, while technologically similar to the Incas, had their own rich cultural traditions and complex political systems that required careful handling. The conquest of the northern kingdoms followed familiar Inca patterns, but with significant variations adapted to local conditions. The Quitu Confederation, centered in the valley that would later become Ecuador's capital, was incorporated through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic marriage alliances. The Inca crown prince, who would later become Manco Cápac, married a Quitu princess, creating familial bonds that helped legitimize Inca rule while providing the local nobility with a stake in the imperial system. The Cañari people presented a different challenge, their fierce independence and military prowess earning them respect even as they resisted Inca expansion. The wars with the Cañari were prolonged and bloody, requiring multiple campaigns before their final submission. In victory, the Incas showed their characteristic appreciation for martial valor, incorporating Cañari warriors into the imperial army as elite troops while respecting their cultural traditions and local leadership structures. By the end of Tupac Inca's reign, around 1493, the Inca Empire had reached its maximum geographical extent, stretching from the equatorial regions of Ecuador to the temperate valleys of Chile, and from the Pacific coast to the eastern slopes of the Andes. This vast territory, covering more than 2,500 miles from north to south, and encompassing virtually every ecological zone found in South America, was home to perhaps 10 million people speaking dozens of languages and practicing hundreds of distinct cultural traditions. The administration of this enormous empire required unprecedented organizational sophistication. Tupac Inca refined and expanded the decimal administrative system developed by his father, creating a hierarchy of officials that could effectively govern diverse populations across vast distances. At the provincial level, Inca governors worked closely with local leaders, balancing imperial requirements with regional needs and customs. The road system reached its full development during this period, with two main highways running the length of the empire, one along the coast and another through the highlands, connected by numerous crossroads that linked every significant settlement to the imperial communication network. Along these roads, the Incas maintained a system of way stations called tambos, spaced a day's journey apart, where travelers could find food, shelter, and fresh llamas for their loads. The economic integration of the empire reached remarkable levels of sophistication under Tupac Inca's rule. Each region was encouraged to specialize in products for which it was best suited, with coastal areas providing fish and cotton, highland regions producing potatoes and other tubers, and tropical areas supplying fruits, coca, and exotic feathers. This specialization was balanced by the state distribution system, which ensured that products from across the empire were available in every region, creating a level of economic integration that would not be seen again in South America until the modern era. The cultural flowering that accompanied this economic integration was equally remarkable. Inca artistic traditions, which had developed in the highlands around Cusco, were enriched by contact with the sophisticated crafts traditions of conquered peoples. Chimu metalworking techniques influenced Inca jewelry and ceremonial objects, while coastal textile traditions added new patterns and weaving methods to highland production. The result was an imperial art style that maintained distinctive Inca characteristics, while incorporating the best elements from across the Andean world. The most visible expression of this cultural synthesis was in architecture, where Inca building techniques reached their highest development during Tupac Inca's reign. The famous Inca stonework, with its precisely fitted blocks and earthquake-resistant construction, was applied to projects across the empire, creating a visual unity that reinforced political integration. Major centers like Pachacamac on the coast, Huánuco Pampa in the central highlands, and Tumi Pampa in Ecuador were rebuilt according to Inca architectural principles. Their plazas, temples, and administrative buildings proclaiming imperial power while serving practical administrative functions. Religious integration followed similar patterns, with local deities incorporated into the expanding Inca pantheon, while the worship of Inti, the sun god, was established in every major settlement. The Incas showed remarkable theological flexibility, recognizing local gods as regional manifestations of universal divine principles, while maintaining the supremacy of their own solar deity. This approach avoided the religious conflicts that plagued other empires, creating instead a syncretic system that satisfied both imperial requirements and local spiritual needs. The reign of Tupac Inca also saw the full development of the Inca educational system, which was essential for training the administrative personnel needed to govern the expanded empire. In Cusco and other major centers, schools called Yachay Huasi were established for the sons of nobles, both Inca and provincial. Here, young men learned Quechua, the imperial language, along with mathematics, engineering, history, law, and religious studies. The curriculum emphasized practical skills needed for imperial administration, while instilling loyalty to the Inca state and its divine ruler. For young women of noble birth, there were corresponding institutions called Aclahuasi, where they were trained in the domestic arts considered appropriate for their station. Some of these women, called mamacuna, would serve as priestesses in the temples of the sun, while others would become wives of nobles or even secondary wives of the Sapa Inca himself. This system ensured that the imperial elite, drawn from across the empire, shared common cultural values and personal relationships that transcended regional and ethnic boundaries. The succession of Tupac Inca around 1493 marked the beginning of what would prove to be the final phase of independent Inca rule. His son, Huayna Cápac, inherited an empire at the height of its power and prosperity, but also one facing new challenges that would test the flexibility and resilience of Inca institutions. Huayna Cápac, whose name meant royal youth, came to the throne as a mature ruler who had already proven himself in military campaigns under his father's leadership. His reign, which lasted until approximately 1525, would be remembered as a period of continued expansion and cultural flowering, but also as the beginning of the internal conflicts that would ultimately make the empire vulnerable to foreign conquest. The new Sapa Inca's first major challenge came in the northern provinces, where the recently conquered peoples of Ecuador were proving difficult to fully integrate into the imperial system. The Quitu Confederation, despite their earlier submission, remained restive under Inca rule, while the fierce Cañari people continued to resist full cultural assimilation. Huayna Cápac's response was characteristically Inca in its combination of force and diplomacy, military campaigns to suppress rebellion, balanced by generous treatment for those who accepted imperial authority. To cement Inca control over the northern provinces, Huayna Cápac established a second imperial capital at Tumipampa, in the heart of what is now Ecuador. This city, built according to Inca architectural principles but incorporating local artistic traditions, was intended to serve as the administrative center for the northern half of the empire, while providing a visible symbol of Inca power and permanence. The construction of Tumipampa represented more than simple administrative convenience. It reflected a fundamental shift in the nature of Inca rule. Where previous Sapa Incas had governed from Cusco with occasional tours of the provinces, Huayna Cápac spent much of his reign in the northern territories, personally overseeing their integration and development. This hands-on approach to imperial administration proved effective in consolidating Inca control, but it also created new tensions within the imperial system. The most significant of these tensions concerned the succession to the throne. Inca royal marriage customs were complex, with the Sapa Inca expected to marry his full sister to produce a pure heir, while also taking secondary wives from noble families across the empire to cement political alliances. Huayna Cápac's primary wife was his sister, Mama Kusirame, but he also married a Quitu princess named Pacha, who became the mother of his son Atahualpa. This arrangement created a succession crisis that would prove fatal to the empire. Huáscar, the son of the primary wife, had the strongest claim to the throne according to traditional Inca law, but Atahualpa, born in the northern provinces and beloved by the armies stationed there, had significant support among the military and northern nobility. The stage was set for a civil war that would tear the empire apart just as it faced its greatest external threat. The reign of Huayna Cápac was also marked by the first inklings of the catastrophe that was approaching from beyond the empire's borders. Reports reached the Sapa Inca of strange ships seen off the coast, carrying bearded men with weapons of unknown power. These reports, initially dismissed as the fantasies of coastal fishermen, were the first signs of Spanish exploration along the western coast of South America. More ominously, diseases began to appear in the northern provinces. smallpox, measles, and other Old World pathogens to which the indigenous populations had no immunity. These epidemics, spreading faster than any human messenger could travel, decimated communities throughout the empire. The Incas, with their sophisticated understanding of public health and their network of healers and medical specialists, were powerless against diseases for which they had no precedent and no cure. The impact of these epidemics on Inca society cannot be overstated. Entire communities were wiped out, trade networks were disrupted, and the carefully maintained balance between population and resources was thrown into chaos. The demographic catastrophe struck at every level of society, from peasant farmers to high nobles, undermining the human resources that had made Inca expansion and administration possible. Manco Cápac himself fell victim to what was probably smallpox around 1525, dying in the northern city of Tumipampa, far from his ancestral capital of Cusco. His death, coming at a moment when the empire faced unprecedented challenges, triggered the succession crisis that had been building throughout his reign. The carefully constructed unity of the Inca Empire, built up over nearly a century of conquest and consolidation, began to unravel in a spiral of civil war and factional conflict. The war between Huáscar and Atahualpa that followed their father's death was not simply a dynastic struggle, but a conflict that divided the empire along geographical, cultural, and political lines. Huáscar, based in Cusco and supported by the traditional nobility of the heartland, represented continuity with established Inca traditions and the centralized authority of the ancient capital. Atahualpa, commanding the armies of the northern provinces and backed by recently conquered peoples who owed their positions to imperial expansion, represented a newer, more militarized vision of Inca rule. The civil war raged for several years, with armies marching back and forth across the empire's length, devastating the very territories they claimed to defend. Both sides employed scorched earth tactics, destroying crops and infrastructure to prevent their enemies from benefiting from them. The road system that had been the empire's greatest strength became a means for rapid movement of hostile armies, while the administrative system that had efficiently governed millions of people was turned to the purposes of organizing destruction. Atahualpa's eventual victory came through his superior military leadership and the loyalty of the professional armies stationed in the northern provinces. His generals, notably Quizquiz and Chalcuchima, proved more capable than Huáscar's commanders, while the northern armies had been hardened by recent campaigns against unconquered peoples beyond the empire's borders. The final decisive battle took place near Cusco itself, where Huáscar's forces were crushed and the legitimate Sapa Inca was taken prisoner. The victory, however, was Pyrrhic. The empire that Atahualpa inherited was devastated by civil war, depopulated by disease, and facing rebellion in several provinces where local leaders had taken advantage of the chaos to assert their independence. The carefully constructed administrative system was in ruins. The road network was damaged, and the storehouses that had ensured imperial prosperity were empty or destroyed. It was at this moment of supreme vulnerability that Francisco Pizarro and his small band of Spanish conquistadors made their second landing on the Peruvian coast. The timing was not coincidental. The Spanish had learned from their earlier reconnaissance voyages that the empire was racked by internal conflict, and they calculated that this presented their best opportunity to achieve what seemed impossible: the conquest of a realm that fielded armies numbering in the tens of thousands with a force of fewer than 200 men. Atahualpa, flush with victory and confident in his military supremacy, received reports of the Spanish landing with curiosity rather than alarm. The bearded strangers, with their strange animals and unknown weapons, were certainly unusual, but they were so few in number that they could hardly pose a threat to an empire that had just mobilized hundreds of thousands of warriors. The new Sapa Inca, resting with his army at the highland city of Cajamarca after his victory over Huascar, decided to meet with these foreigners, perhaps to assess their potential as allies, or to incorporate their unusual skills into his own forces. The meeting at Cajamarca on November 16th, 1532, would prove to be one of the most decisive encounters in human history. Atahualpa arrived with a retinue of several thousand attendants, nobles, and warriors, confident in his divine status and the overwhelming superiority of his forces. The Spanish, hidden in the buildings around the city's main plaza, had carefully planned an ambush that would exploit the confusion of the moment and the psychological impact of their strange weapons and horses. The capture of Atahualpa was accomplished with stunning swiftness. The Spanish attack began with a single cannon shot that scattered the Inca retinue, followed by a cavalry charge that cut through the massed attendants like a scythe through grain. The Inca warriors, despite their numbers and courage, were unable to respond effectively to tactics and weapons utterly unlike anything in their experience. Within hours, the divine ruler of the most powerful empire in the Americas was a prisoner in Spanish hands. The psychological impact of Atahualpa's capture cannot be overstated. In Inca cosmology, the Sapa Inca was not merely a political leader, but a divine being, the son of the sun god Inti himself. His capture by a handful of foreigners challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Inca society was built. If the divine ruler could be defeated by mortals, what did this say about the gods themselves? The shock of this event paralyzed the empire's leadership, preventing the coordinated response that might have overwhelmed the Spanish through sheer numbers. Atahualpa, adapting quickly to his new circumstances, attempted to secure his release through negotiation. He offered to fill a room with gold and silver as ransom, a promise that revealed both his understanding of Spanish motivations and his confidence in the wealth and loyalty of his empire. The collection of this ransom would become one of the most systematic episodes of plunder in history, as Inca nobles stripped temples and palaces throughout the empire to meet their rulers' demands. The gold and silver that flowed into Cajamarca over the following months represented more than mere wealth. It was the physical embodiment of Inca civilization itself. The sheets of precious metal that covered the walls of the Coricancha, the intricate sculptures that adorned royal palaces, the ceremonial vessels used in religious rituals, all were melted down into ingots for easier transport to Spain. The destruction of these artifacts was not merely economic but cultural, representing the systematic obliteration of the material foundations of Inca religious and political life. Despite fulfilling his part of the bargain, Atahualpa was not released. The Spanish, recognizing that their position remained precarious, concluded that the Inca ruler was too dangerous to set free. His execution in 1533 was carried out after a show trial that convicted him of rebellion against the Spanish crown, a legal fiction that provided a veneer of legitimacy to what was essentially a political murder. The death of Atahualpa marked the end of independent Inca rule, but not the immediate collapse of the empire. The Spanish, recognizing their need for legitimacy and their inability to govern such a vast territory without indigenous cooperation, installed Manco Inca, a younger brother of Huascar, as a puppet ruler. This arrangement allowed the Spanish to claim that they were restoring the legitimate Inca dynasty while maintaining effective control over the imperial administration. Manco Inca initially cooperated with the Spanish, perhaps believing that accommodation offered the best hope for preserving something of Inca civilization under foreign rule. He assisted in the Spanish march on Cusco, helped organize the collection of tribute, and participated in the establishment of Spanish colonial administration. For a brief period, it seemed possible that the transition from independent empire to Spanish colony might be accomplished with relatively little disruption to the existing social order. This hope proved illusory. The Spanish conquest was not merely a change of rulers, but a fundamental transformation of society itself. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists the right to extract tribute and labor from indigenous communities, replaced the Inca reciprocal obligations with a one-sided exploitation that offered nothing in return. The missionary efforts to convert the population to Christianity attacked the very foundations of Inca religious belief, demanding the abandonment of practices and beliefs that had defined Andean culture for centuries. The strain of these changes, combined with the personal humiliations inflicted upon him by Spanish officials, who treated him as a subordinate rather than a ruler, eventually drove Manco Inca to rebellion. In 1536, he escaped from Spanish custody and launched a massive uprising that came closer to success than the Spanish ever publicly admitted. The siege of Cusco, which lasted for months, demonstrated that indigenous resistance could still pose a serious threat to Spanish rule when properly organized and led. The rebellion revealed both the potential and the limitations of indigenous resistance to Spanish conquest. Manco Inca was able to mobilize tens of thousands of warriors, demonstrating that the Inca Empire retained significant military capacity even after the catastrophes of civil war and conquest. His forces employed both traditional Inca tactics and innovations learned from fighting the Spanish, including the use of captured firearms and horses. However, the rebellion also revealed the deep divisions within indigenous society that the Spanish had learned to exploit. Many indigenous communities, particularly those that had been recently conquered by the Incas or had suffered under their rule, sided with the Spanish rather than support the restoration of Inca authority. The colonial administration's policy of working through traditional leaders and preserving existing social hierarchies, while modifying them to serve Spanish interests, had created a class of indigenous collaborators with a vested interest in the new order. The failure of Manco Inca's rebellion marked the beginning of a different phase of indigenous resistance. Unable to restore the empire through conventional military means, the surviving members of the Inca royal family established a reduced kingdom in the remote mountain region of Vilcabamba. From this stronghold, they continued to claim legitimate authority over the Inca Empire while conducting a guerrilla war against Spanish rule. The Neo-Inca state of Vilcabamba, as historians have termed it, represented a fascinating attempt to preserve Inca civilization under changed circumstances. The rulers of Vilcabamba maintained the traditional ceremonial and administrative practices of the empire while adapting to the realities of their reduced circumstances. They continued to perform the religious rituals that legitimized their rule, maintained the court practices that had surrounded the Sapa Inca, and collected tribute from communities that remained loyal to the traditional order. Manco Inca ruled the Vilcabamba kingdom until his death in 1544, killed by Spanish refugees who had fled to his court after falling out of favor with colonial authorities. His death was emblematic of the complex relationships that characterized the colonial period, where the lines between collaboration and resistance, friend and enemy, were often blurred by the pragmatic necessities of survival. The the succession passed to his son, Sayri Tupac, who faced the difficult choice between continued resistance and accommodation with Spanish rule. The colonial authorities, recognizing the symbolic importance of gaining the submission of the legitimate Inca heir, offered generous terms for his surrender, including recognition of his noble status and the grant of substantial lands and revenues. In 1558, Sayri Tupac accepted these terms, emerging from Vilcabamba to live as a Spanish noble in Cusco. The submission of Sayri Tupac was celebrated by the Spanish as the final end of Inca resistance, but it proved to be only a temporary respite. Leadership of the Vilcabamba kingdom passed to Titu Cusi Yupanqui, another son of Manco Inca, who proved to be a more skillful diplomat than his brother, but equally committed to preserving Inca independence. Under his rule, the Neo-Inca state entered into complex negotiations with Spanish authorities while maintaining its military preparedness and political autonomy. Titu Cusi's reign was marked by a sophisticated diplomatic strategy that played Spanish factions against each other while preserving the kernel of Inca resistance. He allowed Christian missionaries into his territory, permitting them to preach while maintaining traditional religious practices. He engaged in trade with Spanish merchants while using the profits to purchase weapons and supplies for his forces. He negotiated with colonial officials while secretly maintaining contact with indigenous communities throughout the former empire. This diplomatic balancing act came to an end with Titu Cusi's death in 1571, when leadership passed to his brother Tupac Amaru, the last Sapa Inca. The new ruler, young and inexperienced, lacked his brother's diplomatic skills and faced a changed situation in the colonial capital. The Spanish viceroy, Francisco de Toledo, had concluded that the continued existence of an independent Inca state, however reduced, posed an unacceptable threat to colonial stability. Toledo's campaign against Vilcabamba in 1572 was methodical and overwhelming. Spanish forces, guided by indigenous allies familiar with the mountain terrain, systematically reduced the Neo-Inca strongholds, while cutting off supply lines and escape routes. The final assault on Vilcabamba itself was more of a mopping-up operation than a battle, as most of the defending forces had already been defeated or dispersed. The capture of Tupac Amaru marked the end of the Neo-Inca state and the final collapse of organized resistance to Spanish rule. The young Sapa Inca, brought to Cusco in chains, was tried and executed in the main plaza of the former imperial capital. His death, witnessed by thousands of indigenous onlookers, was intended to demonstrate the futility of resistance and the finality of Spanish victory. Yet even in defeat, the execution of Tupac Amaru served to reinforce rather than diminish his symbolic importance. Many witnesses reported that he faced death with dignity and composure, delivering a speech that acknowledged his defeat while maintaining his divine status and the legitimacy of his rule. His execution became a powerful symbol of indigenous resistance and the continuing relevance of Inca identity under colonial rule. The fall of Vilcabamba marked the end of the Inca Empire as a political entity, but not the end of Inca influence on the history of the Andes. The colonial system that replaced it incorporated many elements of Inca administration, particularly at the local level, where Spanish officials found it expedient to work through existing structures rather than create entirely new ones. The Ayalu system continued to function as the basic unit of social organization, while the Mitae labor obligation was adapted to serve Spanish rather than Inca purposes. The Spanish colonial administration, despite its hostility to Inca political independence, recognized the practical value of many Inca institutions and practices. The road system, though though allowed to deteriorate, continue to serve as the backbone of colonial transportation. The terraced agricultural systems that had sustained the empire continued to feed the colonial population. The administrative divisions established by the Incas formed the basis for colonial administrative units, while the decimal hierarchy of officials was adapted to serve Spanish rather than Inca purposes. More importantly, the cultural and religious practices that had defined Inca civilization proved remarkably resilient under colonial rule. Despite intensive missionary efforts to eradicate indigenous religious beliefs, many traditional practices continued in modified form, often disguised as Christian rituals or combined with Christian elements in syncretic practices that satisfied both indigenous spiritual needs and colonial religious requirements. The survival of Inca cultural elements was facilitated by the Spanish colonial policy of indirect rule, which relied heavily on indigenous intermediaries to govern the native population. These intermediaries, drawn from the traditional nobility and the educated indigenous elite, often used their positions to preserve elements of traditional culture while adapting to colonial requirements. They maintained knowledge of Inca history and traditions, preserved traditional crafts and artistic techniques, and provided continuity between the pre-Columbian and colonial periods. The economic systems developed by the Incas also showed remarkable persistence under colonial rule. The Mita labor system, though modified to serve Spanish rather than Inca purposes, continued to mobilize indigenous labor for large-scale projects. The most notorious example was the Mitar service at the silver mines of Potosi, where indigenous workers were conscripted to extract the precious metal that financed the Spanish Empire. The demographic impact of this forced labor was devastating, but the system itself demonstrated the continuing relevance of Inca organizational techniques. The Great Silver Mountain of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, became a symbol of both the wealth that flowed from Inca territories and the human cost of colonial exploitation. The mine, discovered in 1545, produced more silver than any other source in human history, its wealth flowing across the Pacific to China and across the Atlantic to Europe, fundamentally altering the global economy. Yet this wealth came at an enormous human cost, as indigenous workers died by the thousands in the dangerous conditions of the mountain's interior. The transformation of Inca economic practices under colonial rule extended beyond mining to agriculture and craft production. The Spanish introduced new crops and animals, fundamentally altering the agricultural systems that had sustained the empire. European cattle, horses and pigs competed with indigenous llamas and alpacas for pasture land, while European grains were planted alongside traditional Andean crops. The result was a mixed economy that retained many indigenous elements while adapting to colonial requirements and market opportunities. The textile production that had been one of the glories of Inca civilization continued under colonial rule, but was transformed to serve Spanish purposes. Indigenous weavers, whose ancestors had created the finest textiles in the pre-Columbian Americas, were organized into workshops that produced goods for both local consumption and export to Spain. The technical skills and artistic traditions developed over centuries of Inca rule provided the foundation for a colonial textile industry that remained economically important throughout the colonial period. The architectural heritage of the Inca Empire provided another area of continuity between pre-Columbian and colonial periods. Spanish colonial architecture in the Andes incorporated many elements of Inca building techniques, particularly the use of precisely fitted stone construction that could withstand the frequent earthquakes that plagued the region. Many colonial buildings were constructed on the foundations of Inca structures, while others incorporated Inca walls and architectural elements into Spanish colonial designs. The Great Cathedral of Cusco, built on the site of the Inca Palace of Viracocha, exemplified this architectural fusion. The building combined Spanish colonial Baroque design with Inca construction techniques, its walls built from stones quarried from Inca structures and fitted according to traditional methods. The result was a structure that was both Spanish and indigenous, Catholic and Andean, representing the complex cultural synthesis that emerged from the encounter between two civilizations. The religious synthesis that emerged from the colonial encounter was equally complex and enduring. Despite the official suppression of indigenous religious practices, many traditional beliefs and rituals continued in modified form. The Catholic saints were often identified with traditional Andean deities, while Christian festivals were celebrated with indigenous ceremonial elements. The result was a religious system that was officially Catholic, but retained many indigenous characteristics. The cult of the sun, which had been central to Inca religious practice, found new expression in the worship of Christ, who was identified with the solar deity in popular belief. The Virgin Mary was associated with Pachamama, the Earth Mother of Andean tradition, while the Christian cross became a symbol that incorporated both Christian and indigenous meanings. These religious syntheses provided a way for indigenous communities to maintain their spiritual traditions while adapting to colonial requirements. The preservation of indigenous identity under colonial rule was facilitated by the Spanish policy of creating separate indigenous communities called reducciones, which were intended to facilitate administration and religious conversion, while maintaining social separation between Spanish and indigenous populations. These communities, while subject to colonial authority, often developed a strong sense of local identity that incorporated both colonial and pre-Columbian elements. Within these communities, knowledge of Inca history and traditions was preserved through oral tradition, ceremonial practices, and the continuation of traditional crafts and customs. The Quipu system of record keeping, though no longer used for official purposes, continued to be employed by some communities for local record keeping and the preservation of historical knowledge. Indigenous languages, particularly Quechua, remained the primary means of communication in many areas, ensuring the transmission of cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. The colonial period also saw the emergence of new forms of indigenous resistance and cultural expression. The myth of Incari, which predicted the return of the Inca and the restoration of indigenous rule, became a powerful symbol of hope and resistance. This myth, which combined traditional Inca beliefs with Christian elements, provided a framework for understanding the colonial experience and maintaining hope for eventual liberation. The rebellions that periodically erupted throughout the colonial period often drew inspiration from Inca history and identity. The most significant of these was the rebellion led by Tupac Amaru II in 1780, which took its name and symbolic authority from the last Inca ruler. This rebellion, which spread across much of the former Inca Empire, demonstrated the continuing power of Inca identity as a source of political legitimacy and social cohesion. The rebellion of Tupac Amaru II was remarkable not only for its scope, but for its vision of a multi-ethnic society that would unite indigenous peoples, mestizos, and Creoles under indigenous leadership. The rebellion's manifesto called for the abolition of slavery, the end of forced labor, and the restoration of indigenous rights, while promising to respect the property and interests of non-indigenous supporters. This vision of a reformed society that would incorporate both indigenous and European elements reflected the complex cultural synthesis that had emerged from 3 centuries of colonial rule. The failure of the rebellion and the brutal suppression that followed marked the end of large-scale indigenous resistance during the colonial period, but it also established a powerful precedent for later independence movements. The symbols and rhetoric of Inca resistance continued to inspire later generations of revolutionaries, while the idea of indigenous political leadership remained a powerful force in Andean politics. The wars of independence that swept across South America in the early 19th century drew heavily on Inca symbolism and history. Independence leaders like Simón Bolívar explicitly invoked the memory of the Inca Empire as a source of legitimacy for their cause, arguing that independence would restore the natural order that had been disrupted by Spanish conquest. The new republics that emerged from these wars often incorporated indigenous symbols into their flags and national emblems, while claiming to represent the restoration of pre-Columbian civilization. The reality of independence proved more complex than these symbolic gestures suggested. The new republican governments, dominated by Creole elites of Spanish descent, often proved as hostile to indigenous interests as the colonial administration had been. The abolition of colonial protections for indigenous communities, combined with the implementation of liberal policies that favored individual property ownership over communal land tenure, often left indigenous communities worse off than they had been under colonial rule. Yet the legacy of the Inca Empire continued to influence the development of the new republics, particularly in the areas of national identity and cultural expression. The magnificent ruins of Machu Picchu, Sacsayhuaman, and other Inca sites became symbols of national pride and cultural achievement, while indigenous art and craft traditions were increasingly recognized as important elements of national culture. The 20th century saw a renewed interest in Inca history and culture, driven both by archaeological discoveries and by growing political movements that sought to incorporate indigenous peoples into national life on more equal terms. The scientific study of Inca civilization, based on archaeological evidence rather than colonial chronicles, revealed the remarkable sophistication of Inca engineering, agriculture, and administration, while highlighting the enormous human cost of the conquest and colonial period. The rediscovery of Machu Picchu by Hiram Bingham in 1911 captured international attention and made the Inca Empire a subject of global fascination. The perfectly preserved city, perched on a mountain ridge high above the Urubamba River, provided dramatic evidence of Inca architectural and engineering capabilities, while serving as a powerful symbol of indigenous achievement and Spanish destructiveness. Archaeological investigations throughout the 20th century revealed the full scope of Inca civilization, from the sophisticated urban planning of Cusco to the remarkable agricultural terraces that still dot the Andean landscape. These discoveries challenged earlier assumptions about the primitive nature of pre-Columbian civilizations and demonstrated that the Inca Empire represented one of the most sophisticated states in human history. The political movements that emerged in the 20th century often drew inspiration from Inca history and identity. The indigenista movement in Peru sought to incorporate indigenous peoples into national life while celebrating their cultural heritage and historical achievements. The Bolivian Revolution of 1952 explicitly invoked Inca symbolism and promised to restore indigenous rights and dignity. The Shining Path guerrilla movement of the 1980s claimed to represent the restoration of Inca socialism, though its brutal methods and authoritarian ideology bore little resemblance to actual Inca practices. The legacy of the Inca Empire in the contemporary world extends far beyond political symbolism. The agricultural techniques developed by the Incas continue to sustain millions of people in the Andes, while their understanding of high-altitude agriculture and crop diversity has become increasingly relevant in an era of climate change and food security concerns. The potato, which the Incas developed into hundreds of varieties, remains one of the world's most important food crops, while quinoa and other Andean grains have gained global recognition as nutritious and sustainable foods. The Inca road system, though largely abandoned and partially destroyed, continues to influence transportation patterns in the Andes. Many modern highways follow routes first established by Inca engineers, while the principles of road construction developed by the Incas, particularly their understanding of how to build stable roads in mountainous terrain, continue to inform modern engineering practices. The Quechua language, which served as the lingua franca of the Inca Empire, remains the primary language for millions of people in the Andes. Its survival through 5 centuries of colonial and post-colonial rule demonstrates the remarkable resilience of indigenous culture and identity. The language continues to evolve, incorporating new vocabulary and concepts while maintaining its essential character and serving as a vehicle for the transmission of traditional knowledge and cultural values. The social and political institutions developed by the Incas also continue to influence contemporary life in the Andes. The ALU system of kinship-based organization remains important in many indigenous communities, while the principle of reciprocity that underlay Inca social relations continues to shape interpersonal relationships and community obligations. The concept of aini, or mutual aid, which required community members to assist each other in times of need, remains a fundamental principle of Andean social organization. The religious and spiritual traditions that emerged from the synthesis of Inca and Christian beliefs continue to play an important role in Andean life. The festivals and ceremonies that mark the agricultural calendar often combine Christian and indigenous elements, while the sacred geography of the Andes, the belief that mountains, rivers, and other natural features possess spiritual significance, continues to influence how people understand and interact with their environment. The artistic and craft traditions that flourished under Inca rule have experienced a renaissance in recent decades, as indigenous artisans have gained greater recognition and market access for their work. Traditional weaving techniques, pottery making, and metalworking continue to be practiced and transmitted from one generation to the next, while contemporary artists draw inspiration from Inca designs and motifs in creating new works that speak to both traditional and modern sensibilities. The study of Inca civilization has also contributed to broader understanding of human social organization and cultural development. The Inca Empire's success in governing a vast, diverse territory without written language or wheeled transport has provided insights into alternative forms of political organization and communication. The Inca achievement in creating a unified state from dozens of distinct ethnic groups and cultures offers lessons for contemporary efforts to build inclusive, multicultural societies. The environmental knowledge developed by the Incas, particularly their understanding of how to practice sustainable agriculture in challenging mountain environments, has become increasingly relevant as the world grapples with climate change and environmental degradation. The Inca system of crop rotation, soil conservation, and water management offers models for sustainable development that could be adapted to contemporary conditions. The dramatic story of the Inca Empire's rise and fall continues to captivate popular imagination, inspiring countless books, films, and documentaries. The empire's rapid expansion, sophisticated administration, and tragic destruction provide a compelling narrative of human achievement and loss that resonates across cultures and time periods. The figure of the Inca ruler, divine yet human, powerful yet vulnerable, has become an enduring symbol of both the possibilities and limitations of human power. The archaeological sites left by the Incas continue to attract millions of visitors from around the world, serving as both tourist destinations and sources of national pride for the countries that inherited their territory. Machu Picchu, designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has become one of the most recognized symbols of Latin American culture, while other Inca sites provide important sources of tourism revenue and cultural identity. The preservation and study of Inca heritage has become an important priority for governments and international organizations throughout the Andes. Archaeological projects continue to uncover new information about Inca civilization, while conservation efforts seek to protect the physical remains of their great buildings and infrastructure. These efforts reflect both the continuing relevance of Inca heritage and the challenges of preserving ancient sites in the face of modern development pressures. The final saga of the Inca Empire is not one of complete destruction, but of transformation and persistence. While the political entity that once stretched from Ecuador to Chile disappeared forever with the death of Tupac Amaru in 1572, the civilization that created it continues to influence the world in countless ways. The descendants of the Incas, numbering in the millions, continue to inhabit the lands their ancestors ruled, maintaining traditions and practices that connect them to their imperial heritage, while adapting to the challenges of the modern world. The centuries that followed the fall of Vilcabamba saw the gradual emergence of new forms of indigenous identity and resistance, often expressed through cultural rather than political means. In the remote valleys of the Andes, far from the centers of colonial power, indigenous communities developed sophisticated strategies for preserving their traditions while appearing to conform to colonial requirements. The practice of code switching between public compliance and private resistance became an art form, allowing communities to maintain their essential identity while avoiding the persecution that open defiance would have brought. The colonial chroniclers, writing in Spanish for Spanish audiences, often failed to capture the subtleties of this cultural resistance. They recorded the surface manifestations of indigenous life, the Christian festivals, the tributary obligations, the apparent acceptance of colonial authority, while remaining largely unaware of the parallel world of traditional practices that continue to flourish in private spaces. In these hidden realms, the knowledge of the ancestors was carefully preserved and transmitted, often through the very mechanisms that the colonial authorities had established for Christian instruction. The cargo festivals that emerged during the colonial period exemplified this complex cultural negotiation. These elaborate celebrations, ostensibly honoring Christian saints, incorporated traditional Andean elements in ways that satisfied both indigenous spiritual needs and colonial religious requirements. The sponsors of these festivals, called cargadores, took on enormous financial obligations to provide food, drink, and entertainment for entire communities, recreating on a smaller scale the reciprocal obligations that had characterized the Inca state. These festivals served multiple functions beyond mere religious observance. They provided opportunities for indigenous communities to demonstrate their prosperity and social solidarity, while maintaining the complex networks of kinship and obligation that had sustained Andean societies for centuries. The elaborate textiles, traditional foods, and ceremonial objects displayed during these festivals preserved craft traditions and cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to colonial suppression. The music and dance that accompanied these celebrations maintained direct connections to pre-Columbian traditions while incorporating new elements learned from contact with European and African cultures. The haunting melodies of the quena flute and the driving rhythms of indigenous drums blended with Spanish guitars and African percussion to create new musical forms that express the hybrid nature of colonial society. These musical traditions served as vehicles for the transmission of historical memory, with songs and dances encoding stories of the Inca past and hopes for indigenous futures. The textile traditions that had reached their pinnacle under Inca rule experienced a remarkable revival during the colonial period, as indigenous weavers adapted their skills to new markets and materials while preserving traditional techniques and designs. The Spanish demand for high-quality textiles created opportunities for indigenous artisans to prosper while maintaining their cultural traditions. The complex symbolism embedded in traditional Andean textiles allowed weavers to encode cultural information in ways that colonial authorities could not decode, creating a form of hidden literacy that preserved knowledge across generations. The iconography of colonial textiles often incorporated traditional Andean symbols disguised as Christian or European motifs. The condor might appear as an eagle, the puma as a lion, while traditional fertility symbols were transformed into Christian crosses or saints' attributes. This visual code allowed indigenous communities to maintain their spiritual connections to the natural world while appearing to conform to Christian requirements. The persistence of traditional knowledge extended beyond the realm of cultural expression to encompass practical skills and scientific understanding that had developed over centuries of Andean civilization. The sophisticated understanding of high-altitude agriculture that had sustained the Inca Empire continued to be practiced and refined by indigenous farmers who maintained traditional crop varieties and cultivation techniques. These farmers preserved hundreds of potato varieties, each adapted to specific microclimates and soil conditions, creating a genetic treasury that would prove invaluable to global food security in later centuries. The traditional calendar that had regulated Inca agricultural practices survived in modified form, with indigenous communities maintaining careful observations of celestial cycles and seasonal changes that guided planting and harvesting decisions. This astronomical knowledge, embedded in ritual practices and oral traditions, preserved sophisticated understanding of climate patterns and agricultural timing that often proved more reliable than European-derived methods. The medical knowledge that had developed within Inca civilization also persisted through the colonial period, often in the hands of traditional healers who combined indigenous plant knowledge with European and African medical practices. These curanderos maintained detailed understanding of the medicinal properties of Andean plants, treating ailments with combinations of herbs, rituals, and spiritual practices that address both physical and psychological aspects of illness. The colonial period also saw the emergence of new forms of literary expression that preserved and transformed indigenous narrative traditions. The Spanish introduction of writing systems allowed indigenous intellectuals to record traditional stories and historical accounts that had previously existed only in oral form. These early indigenous texts, written in Quechua or Spanish, but drawing on traditional narrative structures and cultural concepts, created a bridge between pre-Columbian and colonial literary traditions. The most famous of these works was the chronicle of Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, whose massive illustrated manuscript provided a comprehensive indigenous perspective on Inca history and colonial conditions. Written in the early 17th century, this work combined traditional Andean historical concepts with European literary forms to create a unique hybrid text that served both as historical record and political protest. Guamanpoma's drawings, which accompanied his text, preserved visual representations of Inca ceremonies, costumes, and social structures that would otherwise have been lost to time. Other indigenous chroniclers, such as Inca Garcilaso de la Vega and Juan de Santa Cruz Pachacuti, use their bicultural backgrounds to preserve aspects of Inca culture that might otherwise have disappeared. These writers, drawing on family memories and community traditions, recorded detailed accounts of Inca religious practices, social organization, and historical events that provided invaluable sources for later historians and anthropologists. The preservation of indigenous knowledge during the colonial period was facilitated by the emergence of a class of indigenous intellectuals who moved between Spanish and indigenous worlds, serving as intermediaries and cultural translators. These individuals, often educated in colonial schools, but maintaining strong connections to their home communities, developed sophisticated strategies for preserving traditional knowledge while adapting to colonial requirements. Many of these cultural intermediaries served as community leaders, using their understanding of both Spanish and indigenous systems to protect their community's interests while maintaining cultural continuity. They learned to navigate colonial legal systems to defend community land rights, negotiated with religious authorities to preserve traditional practices within Christian frameworks, and maintained the complex networks of reciprocity and obligation that sustained indigenous social organization. The resistance strategies developed during the colonial period often involved the creative reinterpretation of colonial institutions to serve indigenous purposes. The cofradías, or religious brotherhoods, established by the Catholic Church to promote Christian devotion among indigenous populations, were often transformed into vehicles for maintaining traditional social structures and cultural practices. These organizations provided legal frameworks for community cooperation while preserving indigenous leadership patterns and reciprocal obligations. The colonial period also witnessed the development of new forms of indigenous political organization that drew on both traditional Andean concepts and Spanish colonial models. Indigenous communities learned to use Spanish legal institutions to defend their rights, becoming skilled in the preparation of petitions, lawsuits, and other legal documents that could protect their interests within the colonial system. This legal sophistication often surprised Spanish officials who had assumed that indigenous peoples lacked the intellectual capacity for complex legal reasoning. The economic strategies developed by indigenous communities during the colonial period demonstrated remarkable adaptability and resilience. Communities learned to participate in colonial markets while maintaining traditional subsistence practices, developing complex strategies for balancing external obligations with internal needs. The maintenance of traditional ILU land tenure systems alongside participation in Spanish property regimes required sophisticated negotiation and careful management of competing demands. Many indigenous communities developed specializations that allowed them to prosper within the colonial economy while maintaining their cultural identity. Some communities became renowned for their textile production, others for their agricultural products or craft goods. These specializations often built on traditional skills and knowledge while adapting to colonial market demands, creating hybrid economic forms that satisfied both indigenous and Spanish needs. The demographic recovery that began in the 18th century after the catastrophic population decline of the conquest period saw the emergence of new forms of indigenous identity that combined traditional elements with colonial experiences. The mestizo populations that resulted from intermarriage between indigenous and Spanish peoples created new cultural forms that drew on both traditions while developing distinctive characteristics of their own. These new populations often served as intermediaries between indigenous and Spanish worlds, facilitating cultural exchange while maintaining connections to both traditions. The emergence of distinctive mestizo cultural forms, including new musical styles, artistic traditions, and religious practices, enriched the cultural landscape of colonial society while preserving elements of indigenous heritage. The 18th century also witnessed the development of new forms of indigenous political consciousness that drew explicitly on Inca heritage as a source of legitimacy and identity. The rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in 1780 represented the culmination of centuries of cultural preservation and political resistance, demonstrating that Inca identity remained a powerful force for social mobilization, despite nearly 2.5 centuries of colonial rule. The rebellion's vision of a renewed indigenous state that would incorporate both traditional and colonial elements reflected the sophisticated political thinking that had developed within indigenous communities during the colonial period. The rebellion's leaders demonstrated detailed knowledge of both Inca political traditions and contemporary European political thought, creating a hybrid ideology that appealed to diverse constituencies while maintaining indigenous leadership and cultural values. The brutal suppression of the rebellion and the systematic persecution of indigenous leaders that followed demonstrated the Spanish recognition of the continuing threat posed by indigenous political consciousness. The colonial authorities' attempts to eradicate indigenous noble titles, prohibit the use of indigenous languages, and suppress traditional cultural practices revealed their understanding that cultural identity remained the foundation of political resistance. Yet even these repressive measures failed to eradicate indigenous identity and cultural practices. Communities developed even more sophisticated strategies for cultural preservation, often abandoning visible manifestations of traditional culture while maintaining core values and practices in hidden forms. The apparent success of colonial cultural suppression often masked the continued vitality of indigenous traditions that had simply become less visible to colonial authorities. The wars of independence that swept across South America in the early 19th century created new opportunities for indigenous political participation, while also presenting new challenges to cultural preservation. Many indigenous communities initially remained neutral in conflicts between Creole patriots and Spanish royalists, recognizing that both sides represented colonial interests that had little regard for indigenous rights and welfare. However, the rhetoric of independence, with its emphasis on American identity and opposition to European rule, provided new vocabularies for expressing indigenous political aspirations. Independence leaders, like Simón Bolívar, explicitly invoked Inca heritage as a source of legitimacy for their movements, arguing that independence would restore the natural order that had been disrupted by Spanish conquest. The reality of independence proved more complex than these rhetorical flourishes suggested. The new Republican governments, dominated by Creole elites of Spanish descent, often proved as hostile to indigenous interests as the colonial administration had been. The liberal ideologies that influenced the new republics emphasized individual rights and private property in ways that threatened traditional indigenous concepts of communal land tenure and collective identity. The abolition of colonial protections for indigenous communities, combined with the implementation of liberal policies that favored individual property ownership over communal land tenure, often left indigenous communities more vulnerable than they had been under colonial rule. The tribute obligations that had characterized colonial rule were replaced by new forms of taxation and labor conscription that proved equally burdensome while offering fewer protections for traditional practices. Yet the independence period also created new opportunities for indigenous political participation and cultural expression. The weakening of colonial religious authority allowed for more open practice of traditional spiritual beliefs, while the emphasis on national identity created space for the recognition of indigenous heritage as a component of emerging national cultures. The process of nation building that followed independence required the creation of national symbols and narratives that could unite diverse populations under common identities. In many cases, indigenous heritage provided important sources of national symbolism, with Inca imagery and themes becoming central to emerging national cultures. The incorporation of indigenous symbols into national flags, anthems, and civic ceremonies represented both recognition of indigenous contributions and attempts to co-opt indigenous identity for state purposes. The 19th century saw the emergence of new forms of scientific and scholarly interest in Inca civilization that began to challenge colonial narratives about indigenous inferiority and barbarism. The work of scholars like Alexander von Humboldt, who conducted extensive research in the Andes during the early 19th century, provided detailed documentation of indigenous achievements in agriculture, engineering, and social organization that contradicted colonial stereotypes. These scholarly investigations revealed the sophisticated nature of Inca civilization while documenting the continued vitality of indigenous cultural traditions. The recognition that indigenous peoples had created one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations challenged European assumptions about cultural hierarchy and human development, contributing to broader changes in understanding of human diversity and capability. The archaeological discoveries that began in the 19th century and accelerated in the 20th provided dramatic evidence of Inca achievements, while capturing popular imagination around the world. The systematic excavation of Inca sites revealed the full scope of their architectural and engineering capabilities, while the discovery of well-preserved artifacts provided insights into daily life and cultural practices that had been lost to colonial destruction. The rediscovery of Machu Picchu by Hiram Bingham in 1911 marked a turning point in global awareness of Inca civilization. The perfectly preserved city, perched on a mountain ridge high above the Urubamba River, provided dramatic evidence of Inca architectural and engineering capabilities while serving as a powerful symbol of indigenous achievement. The international attention that followed Bingham's discovery helped establish Inca civilization as a subject of global fascination and scholarly study. The 20th century witnessed remarkable advances in understanding of Inca civilization through archaeological research, linguistic studies, and ethnographic documentation of surviving cultural practices. These investigations revealed the sophisticated nature of Inca political organization, economic systems, and cultural achievements, while demonstrating the continuing relevance of traditional knowledge and practices. The development of new archaeological techniques allowed for increasingly detailed understanding of Inca sites and artifacts. Radiocarbon dating provided precise chronologies for Inca development, while aerial photography and satellite imagery revealed the full extent of Inca road systems and agricultural terraces. The application of computer modeling and digital reconstruction techniques allowed researchers to visualize Inca architecture and urban planning in unprecedented detail. Linguistic research provided new insights into Quechua and other indigenous languages, revealing their sophisticated grammatical structures and extensive vocabularies for describing natural phenomena and social relationships. The recognition that these languages encoded complex traditional knowledge systems challenged assumptions about the relationship between literacy and intellectual sophistication. demonstrating that oral cultures could maintain and transmit detailed information across generations. Ethnographic studies of contemporary indigenous communities revealed the persistence of traditional practices and knowledge systems that provided direct links to the Inca past. These studies documented the continued use of traditional agricultural techniques, craft methods, and social organization patterns that had been developed during the imperial period. The recognition that traditional knowledge remained vital and relevant challenged assumptions about progress and modernization while providing valuable insights for contemporary development efforts. The political movements that emerged in the 20th century often drew explicitly on Inca heritage and identity as sources of legitimacy and mobilization. The indigenista movement in Peru sought to incorporate indigenous peoples into national life while celebrating their cultural heritage and historical achievements. This movement produced important works of literature, art, and scholarship that helped establish indigenous culture as a central component of national identity. The Bolivian Revolution of 1952 explicitly invoked Inca symbolism and promised to restore indigenous rights and dignity. The revolutionary government implemented significant reforms, including land redistribution, universal suffrage, and recognition of indigenous languages, while drawing on Inca imagery and rhetoric to legitimize these changes. The revolution's emphasis on indigenous heritage as a source of national strength represented a significant departure from earlier policies that had sought to eliminate indigenous identity. The emergence of indigenous political movements in the late 20th century drew heavily on Inca heritage while developing new forms of political organization and advocacy. These movements combined traditional concepts of community organization and consensus decision-making with modern political techniques and international human rights frameworks. The result was a sophisticated form of indigenous politics that could operate effectively in contemporary political systems while maintaining cultural authenticity. The success of these movements in achieving political recognition and rights represented a remarkable transformation in the status of indigenous peoples. The election of Evo Morales as president of Bolivia in 2005 marked the first time that an indigenous person had been elected to lead a South American nation since the fall of the Inca Empire. Morales's presidency, which lasted until 2019, demonstrated the continued relevance of indigenous political traditions while implementing policies that drew explicitly on Inca concepts of reciprocity and environmental stewardship. The constitutional reforms implemented in Bolivia and Ecuador during this period incorporated indigenous concepts of rights and governance into modern legal frameworks. These constitutions recognize the rights of nature, establish principles of sumac cauce, or buen vivir, good living, and created plurinational states that acknowledged the legitimacy of indigenous political systems alongside Western democratic institutions. The contemporary indigenous movements have also achieved significant success in protecting traditional territories and resources from extractive industries and environmental degradation. These efforts often draw on traditional concepts of the relationship between humans and nature that were central to Inca civilization, demonstrating the continued relevance of indigenous knowledge systems for addressing contemporary environmental challenges. The revitalization of indigenous languages, particularly Quechua, has been another significant achievement of contemporary indigenous movements. Educational programs that teach traditional languages alongside Spanish have helped preserve linguistic diversity while providing indigenous youth with access to traditional knowledge systems. The use of indigenous languages in government, media, and academic contexts has helped legitimize these linguistic traditions while demonstrating their continued vitality. The global recognition of traditional indigenous knowledge systems has created new opportunities for the preservation and transmission of cultural practices that originated during the Inca period. International organizations and academic institutions have developed programs to document and preserve traditional knowledge of agriculture, medicine, and environmental management that could provide valuable insights for addressing contemporary challenges. The climate change crisis has brought renewed attention to traditional indigenous knowledge of environmental management and sustainable development. The agricultural techniques developed by the Incas, including terraced farming, crop rotation, and preservation of genetic diversity, offer important models for adaptation to changing environmental conditions. The traditional understanding of weather patterns and ecological relationships that sustained Inca civilization continues to provide valuable guidance for contemporary environmental management. The preservation and interpretation of Inca archaeological sites has become an important priority for governments and international organizations throughout the Andes. UNESCO World Heritage Site designations for locations like Machu Picchu, Sacsayhuaman, and the historic center of Cusco have provided international recognition and protection while generating tourism revenue that supports local communities. However, the challenge of balancing preservation with access and economic development remains ongoing. The development of cultural tourism based on Inca heritage has created both opportunities and challenges for indigenous communities. While tourism provides important economic benefits and helps raise awareness of indigenous culture, it also risks commodifying traditional practices and disrupting fragile archaeological sites. The challenge of developing sustainable tourism that respects cultural authenticity while providing economic benefits continues to require careful negotiation and management. The digital age has created new opportunities for the preservation and transmission of Inca heritage. Digital archives, virtual reality reconstructions, and online educational resources have made information about Inca civilization accessible to global audiences, while providing new tools for cultural preservation. Social media platforms have allowed indigenous communities to share their perspectives on their heritage, while connecting with indigenous peoples around the world. The study of Inca civilization continues to yield new insights and discoveries that expand understanding of their achievements and influence. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed previously unknown Inca sites while providing new information about their engineering capabilities, social organization, and cultural practices. The application of new technologies, including satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and chemical analysis, continues to reveal hidden aspects of Inca civilization. The interdisciplinary approach that characterizes contemporary Inca studies draws on archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, astronomy, engineering, and other fields to provide comprehensive understanding of this remarkable civilization. This collaborative approach reflects recognition that Inca achievements encompassed multiple domains of knowledge and cannot be understood through any single disciplinary lens. The legacy of the Inca Empire in the contemporary world extends far beyond academic study and cultural preservation. The principles of social organization, environmental management, and community cooperation that characterized Inca civilization continue to influence contemporary approaches to sustainable development and social justice. The recognition that indigenous peoples developed sophisticated solutions to complex social and environmental challenges has contributed to broader reconsideration of assumptions about progress and development. The story of the Inca Empire serves as both inspiration and warning for contemporary societies. The remarkable achievements of Inca civilization in creating a unified, prosperous state that managed to govern diverse populations across vast territories, while maintaining environmental sustainability, provide positive models for addressing contemporary challenges. At the same time, the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated civilizations to external threats and internal divisions serves as a sobering reminder of the fragility of human achievements. In the high valleys of the Andes, where the empire began, farmers still plant potatoes in terraced fields carved from mountainsides by their ancestors. The stones fitted so precisely by Inca masons still stand in Cusco's walls, earthquakes having failed to shake them loose after 5 centuries. The sun still rises over the peaks of the Cordillera, and in indigenous communities throughout the Andes, people still greet the dawn with reverence and gratitude, remembering the time when their ancestors built an empire that reached toward the heavens themselves. The condor still soars over the mountains, its shadow falling across landscapes that remember the footsteps of the Sapa Inca and the voices of his people. In the whisper of wind through the ruins of Machu Picchu, in the songs that echo through the valleys of the Andes, in the faces of the people who call these mountains home, the spirit of the Inca Empire endures. The golden staff of Manco Cápac may have long since disappeared, but the civilization it founded left roots that reached deep into the heart of the Andes, sustaining life and culture through all the changes that the centuries have brought. The story of the Inca Empire, which began with a prince emerging from the sacred waters of Lake Titicaca, ends not with conquest and destruction, but with continuity and adaptation. The empire that once united half a continent under the rule of the children of the sun has become something different, but no less remarkable, a living heritage that continues to enrich the world with its wisdom, beauty, and enduring human spirit. In this transformation, the Incas achieved a kind of immortality that no military conquest could have provided, becoming not just a chapter in history, but a continuing presence in the life of the Andes and the consciousness of the world.